All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. There will only be one lecture this week since I did an extra video last week about writing your paper, so I said I would keep it down to one lecture this week to give you some extra time to do your work. So I'm going to talk for about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes here today about August Wilson's great play Fences, which will be the second of two plays we're reading this semester. So at the very beginning we did A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams, and now we are doing August Wilson's Fences from 1985 here in the middle of the course. And there are some similarities between these plays. I think Wilson was very aware, well, we'll talk about this. Wilson was very aware of his precursors in American drama, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller. And so I've labeled this week's unit Modern Tragedy Redux, where redux just means again, so modern tragedy is what we called A Streetcar Named Desire. I think we can call Fences a modern tragedy as well. And also, one of the reasons I think just give an hour-long lecture on this play is because I don't really think we need any new concepts to understand it. I think everything I'd want to say conceptually about tragedy, about realism, about multiculturalism, which are some of the three main contexts in which I put this play, we've already talked about in previous weeks. I will talk a little bit about this idea of magical realism, which I mentioned last week as well, but we're not going to fully get into magical realism and what it is until next week, when I want to talk about realist fiction at the end of the 20th century. So that's just a little preamble. The image on the slide, so August Wilson is probably the greatest writer to come from my own hometown of Pittsburgh, though he also spent, I think, over a decade here in the Twin Cities. I think he lived in St. Paul in the 80s and wrote his most famous plays here in the Twin Cities. So he has a connection both to the city I come from of Pittsburgh and to the city we are in now, the cities we are in now. But the image on the slide is just a picture I took a few years ago of the view outside of August Wilson's birthplace in Pittsburgh in the Hill District, and I thought that it might be an interesting visual. So I don't know if those two buildings were there when he was growing up. I think probably at least the lighter sort of silver one probably wasn't. But so we'll talk about the Hill District and the geography of Pittsburgh in a minute. But I thought it might be an interesting image, just so you can see the street, that Fences might take place on. I mean, we're not given the street name, but this is the neighborhood in which Fences is set. So that's just a picture I took a couple years ago that I thought might be an interesting illustration. All right, so who was August Wilson? Let's talk about his biography, and then I want to talk about some of his ideas, and then I want to get into the specifics of the play Fences. So he lived from 1945 to 2005, and he was born and raised in Pittsburgh. So he had his father was a German immigrant, a white man, and his mother was a black woman who had come from the South during that period of the Great Migration, which we've mentioned a couple times in the course as some of the background for early and mid 20th century African American literature. And so he was their son, and his original name was, I think, I didn't take down his original name, but he had his father's last name, which I think was Kittle. Frederick August Kittle, I think, was his name. But he didn't get along with his father. I don't think the marriage lasted, and he later, his mother remarried, and he got along much better with his stepfather. And so he sort of shed these names of his father and took on the name August Wilson. And he was born in the Hill District, which is Pittsburgh's historically black neighborhood, so called because it's literally on a hill kind of overlooking the city. Pittsburgh is a very hill-based city. And it's kind of in the Appalachian mountain range. Pittsburgh is a strange city, I must tell you. It is at once a northeastern, a midwestern, and a southern city all in one. It's sort of this nexus of everything that happens east of the Mississippi in the United States. So it has it sort of sits at the top of the Appalachians in continuity with the South, and has aspects of Southern culture And Wilson was very attentive to his kind of Southern legacy, to the legacy particularly of blues music that's coming from the Mississippi Delta that was a decisive influence on his work. It's also the kind of industrial and then post-industrial city that was called the Gateway to the West, because that's where you would pass through when people were going out west in the 19th century. And then also it has the immigrant profile, particularly the European immigrant profile of northeastern cities like New York City. That's where my people come in. And Wilson makes a contrast between the European immigrants and the African Americans of the Great Migration that we're going to look at the beginning of the play. So Pittsburgh is it's a great city for a writer to be from, because it has I'm just sort of boasting now, but it has these many different shaping nexus-like influences. So he was born and raised in the Hill District, and then I think when his mother remarried, they moved out. And Wilson didn't have much enjoyment with his formal education. He had a famous conflict with a teacher who thought he had plagiarized a work, presumably on the racist assumption that he couldn't write such sophisticated work. So he just stopped going to school and got a private formal education at the Carnegie Library, the main branch in Oakland, which was on my university campus. I spent many years there myself. And so he got his informal education. He probably, honestly, maybe I shouldn't say this, he probably got a better education just going to the library and reading the books he wanted to read than he might have gotten in the public, or I think it was a Catholic high school curriculum at the time. So he got his informal education there, and then he gets a job. He gets a series of jobs, and so he also had this education in life, in the life of the city around him, and so if you look at his age, 1945 is when he's born, so he's coming of age, he's in his 20s in the late 60s, and he's getting involved in the theater of the Black Power movement and the Black Arts movement, which we discussed earlier as the context for the writing of the 60s. And so that's where he gets into theater. He starts out as a poet and a short story writer, but he ends up becoming a playwright. He eventually moves in the late 70s to St. Paul, and I think he wrote most of his major plays while living in St. Paul. And he tended to write, the picture shows this, he tended to write in bars, cafes, restaurants, because he liked to hear the world around him. He was a vernacular writer, a writer of everyday language and of everyday people. And so he liked to sort of be immersed in those voices as he was conjuring those voices on the page. So he lives in the Twin Cities for the 80s, which is when he writes his major plays, the plays that are acclaimed to be his best, such as Fences and Joe Turner's Come and Gone and others. And then he eventually moves to Seattle, where he spends the rest of his life. He's married 3 times. He has 2 children, and then he dies of cancer at the rather young age, unfortunately, of 60. He is considered probably the major American dramatist of his generation, and his best-known work, if Fences is his most famous and acclaimed and anthologized and widely taught play, it's important to note that it's only part of a cycle of 10 plays that was really these were his life's work, the Century Cycle. And each play is set in a decade of the 20th century, largely in this Pittsburgh neighborhood of the Hill District. I think all but one are set in Pittsburgh. So Fences it stands on its own, and they're not, I don't think, I haven't read every single play in the Century Cycle. I don't think they're related in the sense that they share characters, though. So it's not like you have to read them all to appreciate one. They're each freestanding, but they each kind of exemplify a different time period in African American history. And that's the quote from the Norton Anthology that I chose to emphasize. They begin their biography of him by saying, in a preface to a collection of his plays, he said, Writing a play for me is like walking down the landscape of the self, unattended, unadorned, exploring what D.H. Lawrence called the dark forest of the soul. The evident sincerity, even solemnity of this pronouncement, I am getting so tired of these people. Why are they so judgmental in these bios? But anyway, now I'm being judgmental of them, and we're in this endless meta standoff of judgmentality. Anyway, let me go on. The evident sincerity, even solemnity, of this pronouncement indicates the heroic intensity with which Wilson conceived his artistic mission. That mission was nothing less than to provide a collective history of African American experience in the 20th century. By centering his plays in different decades, Wilson hoped to use them as chronicles on an epic scale of the conflicts, joys, and sufferings of Black people. Put them all together and you have a history, he said about his plays. And what interests me there is there's a productive tension between the two things that are being said there. He says, I write, I'm wandering into the dark forest of my own soul when I write, on the one hand. On the other hand, my plays are social history. They're kind of socio-political, cultural history. So I think that's what makes Wilson, I call it a productive tension rather than a contradiction, because I think it's what makes his work great, that it has this social quality, this epic social chronicle, using literature to do a kind of work of the mental and cultural history of a people, but it never feels like you're reading a history book or you're reading a political argument, because it's always so deeply rooted in the psyches of the characters and in the emotions and in the struggles of the characters. So it has this embodiment of history rather than just some distant discursive telling of it. And I think that's an important thing to note. And I have another on this slide quotation from Wilson from a famous speech he gave advocating for an independent African-American theater. He gives the speech in the 90s called The Ground on Which I Stand. And he says at the beginning of the speech, "In one guise, the ground I stand on has been pioneered by the Greek dramatists, by Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, by William Shakespeare, by Shaw, Ibsen, and Chekhov, Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams. In another guise, the ground that I stand on has been pioneered by my grandfather, by Nat Turner, by Denmark Vesey, by Martin Delany, Marcus Garvey, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. That is the ground of the affirmation of the value of one's being, an affirmation of his worth in the face of this society's urgent and sometimes profound denial." So I think that's an interesting quote. I love lists. I think lists are really telling when people make lists of what they value. And so on the one hand, it's clear what he's saying. He says, first, I'm a dramatist, and I'm a dramatist in a Western tradition that really starts with the Greek playwrights. There are other dramatic traditions in the world, in India and China, but I am a dramatist in this Western tradition. So my precursors, my predecessors, are the Greek playwrights. They are Shakespeare. They are the great modern playwrights from Shaw to Tennessee Williams. So that's one thing. One of the things I want to get at here is the way in which he's a multiculturalist. So he's kind of combining cultural elements. I acknowledge that I'm in this Western tradition. Then he says there's another tradition feeding into my work. And this is the interesting list, because the first list he gives is a pretty standard list of who the great Western playwrights have been. Both of these lists, by the way, are all male, which a feminist would want to point out and would probably, I think we can concede, want to critique that aspect. So these two all-male lists, these two patrilineal lineages, he claims. But the second list is much more particular than the first list. The first list is the standard list of great playwrights. The second list is a very particular selection of African-American precursors. The people who aren't on this list are, for instance, Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King. The people who aren't on this list are people who you might associate with the civil rights position. We talked, I think, earlier in the class about the civil rights versus the Black Power position. And the civil rights position was, I think, their way of saying it would have been universalist. We want the rights we've been promised by these documents and by these traditions of Christianity and liberalism. But then the Black Power tradition said, no, we have our own culture, which was forged in struggle, and it's not the same as this other culture. And, we saw a very strong statement of that in Ishmael Reed. And I think August Wilson is, to a considerable degree, kind of on Ishmael Reed's side, though he thinks of the culture very differently, I think, than Reed does. And so the list he gives of his African-American predecessors are, we might say, the anti-assimilationist, the separatist position. So Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey led rebellions during the time of slavery, armed struggles against slavery. Martin Delany was a 19th century black abolitionist who called for, Delany essentially said, black people can never be sovereign and free in the United States because the political structure of the United States is based on the oppression of black people. So he called for them to leave and set up their own nations in, I think he was looking at the Caribbean and Latin America. Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century, he called for a movement for African Americans to go to Africa and sort of, I think he phrased it, go back to Africa, that's where their heritage was. And Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, has a kind of spiritually inflected black separatism. So, and this is another productive tension, because on the one hand, Wilson says my predecessors are these somewhat separatist thinkers of the African-American radical tradition, and yet I also acknowledge that I work in this European lineage, ultimately, of drama. And he says, essentially, in this speech, he says, we can meet all peoples who are artists can meet on the ground of making art, but we do belong to radically different cultures with radically different experiences, and we mustn't compromise that. And so that's why he's saying there needed to be all black theaters. He was calling for the funding of all black theaters, and one of the interesting things about the speech is he rejects colorblind casting in acting. He says there shouldn't be a black Hamlet, or there have been all black productions of A Streetcar Named Desire. He says there shouldn't be that because race is the most, he says race is the most important thing about a person. I think he said, I am an African American before I am a man or an artist. And so race was in the forefront for him. So that's a little outline of his thinking about himself as an artist, as a man, as a black man, and what he saw his tradition as. So that's my little introduction to August Wilson. Now I want to turn more specifically to fences. So the only sort of conceptual lead-in to fences I want to give now is just I want to think through its genres. And I want to put it in three genres, or maybe 2.5 genres, and two of these we've already discussed, so I can go through them quickly. One of them I mentioned, and we'll discuss in more detail next week. So the first is, I think this is a realist play, and so was Streetcar Named Desire. I didn't emphasize that it was a realist play because it had so much else going on with Southern Gothic and tragedy and everything else, but realism is a genre of drama as much as of fiction. It's a genre in which you have a focus on everyday life, especially among the middle and working classes, in or around the author's own time, and subject matter that mostly avoids the supernatural or the fantastical, and a relatively straightforward style. And we've seen now, not only have we seen realism before, we've seen some anti-realist texts, whether they were experimentalist in the manner of Grace Paley or Thomas Pynchon, or whether they were in fantastical, fully fantastical genres like Ursula K. Le Guin or Philip K. Dick. And so we've seen realism and the counter to realism. Now, the second term and the second genre with which I want to associate fences is magical realism. So this is a very broad label, mostly used for fiction, for 20th and 21st century fiction, that is set in a recognizable social landscape among everyday people, so it's realist, but that has incursions of the fantastical, supernatural, or surreal. It's a movement related to postmodernism and multiculturalism because it calls reality and other grand master narratives into question, as postmodernism does. And sometimes the thing that's sort of called magic in magical realism is the emergence into the text of cultural beliefs repressed by Western or modern ideology. So it's often a multiculturalist genre. And we talked about Toni Morrison last week, and I said she was really the main exponent. She didn't like the term magical realism, but she was sort of the main exponent of magical realism in contemporary American literature. But the thing we read by her did not have those elements. Similarly with August Wilson, Fences is one of his least magically realist plays. He has other plays that openly have sort of spiritual presences on stage. This one just kind of hints. This one is, I think, his attempt to write a realist drama that can stand with Death of a Salesman and Streetcar Named Desire, whereas his other plays are more experimental. But I still think there are hints of magical realism in Fences that I want to look at. And then I would also say, and Wilson himself said that his tradition, he has two traditions. One of them begins with Greek tragedy. So this is also a tragedy. So tragedy, just as a review, is a type of drama derived from ancient Greek religious ritual, but surviving into the modern era. And its characteristics are a noble hero, and that used to be noble in a social sense, an aristocrat, a king. But over the modern period, that nobility was transferred into a kind of moral characteristic, that there's some kind of nobility of character that the hero possesses, whatever his or her social rank. And this character is brought low, is either killed or defeated by a flaw in this otherwise admirable character. There's something about the character's own personality that brings this character low. And the last element of tragedy is that the flaw and the fall somehow exemplify the fate of a larger community or collective. So it's not just an individual story. It's not just one person's tragedy. In Blanche Dubois, it was the tragedy of the South. In ancient Greek tragedy, it's always the tragedy of the city-state in which it's set. And here, I think Wilson is trying to write the tragedy of 20th century African-American manhood, masculinity. This is the thing that has a nobility forged in struggle, but it also, that struggle has had bad consequences as well on this character that brings him low. And so on the one hand, it's this grand spectacle of this great man, but also the fall of this very flawed man who does many things that are unforgivable, that are terrible, as did Blanche Dubois. You remember, Blanche Dubois was not a morally flawless heroine. She did terrible things. So Troy in Fences does terrible things. Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman does terrible things. And yet their fall is still a tragedy, because the terrible things they do are the excesses and the flaws of a character that also has something noble about it. And so that's the particular feeling you get from tragedy, that you've watched this grandly flawed person meet their fate. So that's my lead-in to Fences in terms of the genres it occupies. And now for the remainder of the class, I just kind of want to look at the text and see what we can get out of it. So that's what I'm going to do. Sorry, I can't see, when I project like this, I can't see the time on the computer, and also I don't know where my phone is, so I don't know how I'm doing for time. So I'm just going to, sorry if I'm going too fast or too slow. I'm doing what I can. All right, so the first thing I want to do is take a high-level view of the conflicts in the play. So conflict is a key part of drama, I think, almost more than any other type of literature, because drama doesn't have what fiction has, where it can be sort of discursive, it can be descriptive. A lot of it can just take place in characters' minds or in descriptions of the outside world. Drama is really about the people on stage and what they do. And to make that interesting, usually what they do is fight. So in most plays. So what are the conflicts in this play? What is this play all about at that level of characters and conflict? Because Wilson, aside from that preamble where he gives you a little setting description about the city, which we're going to look at next, he otherwise is not an overtly, he doesn't do a lot of overt commentary. It's a drama. It's the struggle of characters, and their struggle embodies certain ideas, but Wilson doesn't preach about what the ideas are. That's why this play is so much better, by the way, than Death of a Salesman, which I know, when you teach fences, you're supposed to teach Death of a Salesman too, and I know I chose Streetcar Named Desire instead of Death of a Salesman, which is in the book, but I just don't think Arthur Miller's on the level of Tennessee Williams and August Wilson, to be honest with you. I just don't quite see it. I think he's preachy. He doesn't have a great way with words. I don't know. It's not my favorite. But it's in the book. Check it out. You can read Death of a Salesman. It's in the book, and you can see if a lot of people disagree with me on this. So, and it makes a great comparison with Fences. I think in many ways, Wilson was talking back to Arthur Miller. But anyway, that's a digression. So I call this slide Troy's Wars, and I call that also kind of as an allusion. Arthur Miller is great, or August Wilson is great with names. His characters often have names that are somehow symbolic or evocative of the character's situation. And I think we see this a lot in Fences. So Troy, what does Troy evoke? Well, Troy for me, again, it goes back to the setting of so much Greek tragedy, which is around the Trojan War, the war between Greece and Troy, that Homer writes about in the Iliad, the epic poem, and that is also written about either the war itself or its aftermath by all the great Greek playwrights that Wilson named, such as Aeschylus, well, not such as, the three great ones, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And so Troy, I think, evokes, so Troy was defeated by Greece, and the Trojan War ends with the Greeks besieging the city, setting fire to the city. But it had been a grand and a great city. And so I think this name, Troy, evokes falling greatness, greatness that can't last. This complex man, this besieged city of a man. So that name, so that's why I call it Troy's Wars. But we also have Rose, which is... Oops, sorry, I switched the slide. I'll go back. We also have Rose, who is his wife, and that's Rose is all, as a metaphor for love, usually. So the main love relationship in the play. We have Gabriel, his brother, who has been mentally disabled in the war, but who's carrying around a trumpet. He represents the angel Gabriel, who will blow the trumpet at the last judgment. So, and that's said right out in the play. Who else? We have Troy's best friend, Bono. So Bon, buono, good. His good friend. He always gives good advice. We have Lyons, who is this the most uncompromising of Troy's sons, and his name is explained right in the play when Gabriel calls him King of the Jungle. So the only names I don't quite get, I don't get Corey. I haven't made anything out of that. I mean, Cor, heart. Something about the heart, but I haven't fully figured that one out. And Troy's mistress, Alberta, I haven't done anything with Alberta, and his daughter with Alberta, Raynell. And she does, there's Ray, so the kind of ray of sunshine. She is kind of the bright development in Rose's life, ironically, by the end of the play, so maybe something there. But names in August Wilson, you'll never go wrong looking at the names for significance. So that's a digression. What I want to talk about here is the conflict. So what are Troy's conflicts? I think he has a conflict with both of his sons, particularly Corey. And he has three, by the end of the play, he has three children by three different women. So his Corey is the son he has with his first wife, and then he spends some time in prison due to a fight he gets into due to the fact that he's forced into becoming a criminal, a thief, when he first comes to Pittsburgh because of the ways in which black men were shut out of the labor market. And so this leads to him going to prison. And we're that's a very non-linear play. We're told everything in flashbacks or in sort of mentions that go throughout the drama that otherwise takes place over the course of first a couple months and then a couple years in his life. So then he meets Rose and has Corey and is able to get himself set up with a house because of the money he gets from the government to care for Gabriel. And he has Corey, and that's where the play sort of begins, with Corey growing up and his marriage to Rose. And these two things are reaching their crisis. So what is his conflict with his sons? Well, Troy, who wanted to play professional baseball but wasn't able to for a series of reasons. One, his wife tells him it's because you were too old. He also quite correctly points out the segregation that had existed in baseball at the time. And so he thinks he missed his chance to be a great athlete. And he clearly resents the fact that his son, who is able to get a college scholarship to play football, is going to follow in his footsteps as a great athlete. And so he tells him, you can't win. You can't, the white man will never let you win at athletics. So I'm not going to let you do this. And this is part of Troy's character, is that he's unable, as his Rose keeps saying to him, he's unable to see the way in which the world has changed, that the things that he fought against have abated somewhat, that there's more. They're in the 50s, they're heading into the 60s, the civil rights movement is happening. There is progress on the racial front, and so while it's terrible what he faced, his sons aren't necessarily going to face the same thing to the same extent, and so he can't take their opportunities from them. And that's, I think, the first unforgivable thing he does in this play, is takes Corey's opportunity away from him. So Corey is not able to go to college and play football and ends up joining the Marines instead. Lyons, his older son from his previous marriage, it's actually a similar conflict as the one we saw in Sonny's Blues. Lyons wants to be an artist, a musician, can't work a 9-to-5 job, as he feels. And so he's always kind of coming around asking for money, though he does pay Troy back by the end. But he himself gets into some trouble and ends up sort of, he says the workhouse. I guess he's like on probation for passing or for cashing other people's checks, he says. So he's kind of had a difficult life because he doesn't live up to Troy's sense of responsibility. So that's his conflict with his sons. And he has a conflict with Rose about that. Number one, she thinks he's living in the past. He can't get past his own tragic history to allow his sons to live their own lives. And then the other conflict that develops with Rose, to whom he's been married for 18 years, is that he is cheating on Rose with Alberta. And he says, and I think Wilson is a good playwright because he's not moralizing. Troy explains himself, and it's psychologically plausible, even if not morally convincing. He says, I associate everything in this house with crushing responsibility, is basically what he tells Rose. And for that reason, I needed to go somewhere where I could just enjoy myself. He says I can laugh in her house because I don't own her house. I don't have to put a roof on her house. I don't have to pay for her house, so I can laugh with her. But Rose quite correctly tells him that, well, what about me? How do you think I feel? Don't you think I also feel these burdens? And yet I don't betray you, and you betray me. So, and we'll look at those passages more closely. So that's his conflict with Rose. We also learn that a lot of his conflicts with his son come from his conflict with his father. That his father, and this is one of the ways in which Wilson so greatly crystallizes so much history into the lives of his characters. His father appears to have lived in the South during the era after slavery of the kind of sharecropping period, where a lot of African Americans were forced to work nominally for pay on the land of the people who used to be the slave owners, but it was only sort of a marginal improvement from slavery in a way. They were sort of working in the same place for a in theory, a remuneration, but it wasn't really. They were sort of in a kind of debt bondage. And so his father seemed to have been working, we're not given a lot of details, but seems to be working in that world. And his father has been really sort of corrupted by his environment. And so his father was very hard on him, as he will later be on his sons, but his father is also extremely abusive. And not only to him, but he says the way he tells it is he was sort of shirking the work his father asked him to do, and he ran off to kind of have a sexual experience with this young woman who was his girlfriend, and his father catches them. And it's not only that he's mad that Troy is neglecting his work, but the father goes after this 13-year-old girl sexually. And so Troy gets into a fight with his father and eventually runs away and goes north and ends up in Pittsburgh, where he doesn't really find opportunity and is forced to become a thief until he gets out of prison and is able, with the windfall of the pay from his brother's injury in the war, to set himself up independently. But this conflict with his father is looming large. And you can see that while Troy does a lot of bad things, he doesn't do anything as bad as his father does. So I think Wilson and Corey in particular looks like he's going to be a better man than Troy. And so you do see this kind of progressive narrative down the generations. There is some escape. They each take on elements of one another. There is this lineage, there is this heritage, but they aren't the worst things their father were. I would also say that Troy has a conflict with America itself. First, in the very brute form of America's racism, which leads to the lifestyle, the way of life that sort of disfigures the character of his father. It leaves him without opportunity. It punishes him. It makes him unable to live out his ultimate ambition as a great athlete, and in that way kind of corrodes his character in ways that make him destructive to his own family. So he's fighting this broader social landscape, though he does get a victory over America, we might say, because what is Troy's profession? He is a garbage man, and he is fighting this battle at work over racial discrimination, where he says that the way the system is set up is the guys who drive the garbage trucks are the white men, and the men who have to haul the garbage are black men. And it's just this strict racial division. And he says, and he protests at his job. Why is this so? And he wins out. At the beginning, they're worried he's going to get fired for making trouble at work. But it turns out that he is able to get this victory, and he becomes the driver on the truck rather than the person who hauls the garbage. But it's interesting, and this plays into another theme in the drama, which is that he says it's kind of alienating. Like, there's camaraderie with the garbage haulers, but if you drive the truck, you're kind of alone. And so is this accession of black people into the middle class totally a good thing? And so we'll have to look at that. And then, as in any good tragedy, he also has this conflict with himself, and he talks to himself. He gives monologues, he gives soliloquies throughout the play, where he's fighting his own feelings. And he says, "I listen to my heart, and my heart doesn't lead me wrong." I don't know if the play really shows that to be the case necessarily all the time, especially his betrayals of Corey, of Rose, and then of Gabriel. Gabriel, there's been this conflict between him and Rose about if Gabriel should go to an institution, because is he able to live on his own with his disability? And Troy gives kind of these high-minded statements at the beginning of the play. Oh, no, he shouldn't. Let the man be free. He's okay. We don't want to put him in an institution. And Rose's point is a good one, too, that, well, he might just do better there with professionals who can care for him. They're each making, I think, valid points. And then Troy does eventually have Gabriel committed to an institution, and Rose says, "Well, you just did this cynically because you could get some more money off of his benefits that way." And so that's, I think, the third thing he does that's really hard to deal with. So he's not in any way an unflawed or a perfect character, and yet there's also this grandeur of spirit that he possesses in some of the same ways we saw with Blanche Dubois. I think this is a characteristic of tragic drama, so that you can't approve of the character morally, but you can't look away from their largeness of spirit. So I want to look through some passages in the play. I don't have that many, but I just want to point out a couple notes. So the first one is, much like Tennessee Williams does, August Wilson, after saying I don't like Arthur Miller, I keep calling August Wilson Arthur Miller. It's because of the same rhythms of the name. August Wilson begins with this stage description, this stage setting that doesn't just tell his theatrical collaborators what's going to be on the stage, what should be the props and the backdrops. It's also telling the people he knows will be his readers, because remember what we said with Williams, that the modern playwright understands that they will have more readers in the long run than viewers, that drama is also a print medium, a reading medium now. And so he's, I think, now speaking to his readers. So here's what he says. Near the turn of the century, the destitute of Europe sprang on the city with tenacious claws and an honest and solid dream. The city devoured them. They swelled its belly until it burst into 1,000 furnaces and sewing machines, 1,000 butcher shops and bakers' ovens, 1,000 churches and hospitals and funeral parlors and money lenders. The city grew. It nourished itself and offered each man a partnership limited only by his talents, his guile, and his willingness and capacity for hard work. For the immigrants of Europe, a dream dared and won true. So he's saying, the city, which is the northern and Midwestern cities, but Pittsburgh in particular, immigrants from Europe came. Southern and Eastern European immigrants, largely Catholic and Jewish, white immigrants came. This is my own background. And they were able to earn the prosperity that they weren't able to earn back in what my late grandmother always called the old country. And so that's one thing that happens in the city. Now, then he says, here's the other thing that happens. The descendants of African slaves were offered no such welcome or participation. They came from places called the Carolinas and the Virginias, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. They came strong, eager, searching. The city rejected them, and they fled and settled along the riverbanks and under bridges and shallow, ramshackle houses made of sticks and tar paper. They collected rags and wood. They sold the use of their muscles and their bodies. They cleaned houses and washed clothes. They shined shoes, and in quiet desperation and vengeful pride, they stole and lived in pursuit of their own dream, that they could breathe free finally and stand to meet life with the force of dignity and whatever eloquence the heart could call upon. So African Americans in the Great Migration did not receive the same welcome, were not able to achieve the same prosperity in the same way and on the same timeline, and were forced, even in some ways, to live an outcast and a criminal life when they first arrived. And so this contrast between the American dream available to the immigrant. And we've talked about how, when we read Philip Roth and we read Amy Tan, we talked about how that's not without its own pitfalls and challenges that they write about quite incisively. But I think for Wilson, the main division in American life is not immigrant or non-immigrant, and it might not even be white and non-white. It might be black and non-black. And in that case, black people are treated in a way that even immigrants who had their own challenges were not treated, and were treated worse and were excluded in more thoroughgoing ways and had a greater journey to go and a greater conflict to confront in their own accession to the American dream. In Wilson, there's not much, I don't really see that much of a critique really of the dream itself. I don't know how much there's really a critique of what you might see a critique of capitalism or something. I don't really necessarily see that. For him, I think the main marker is race. And so that's the conflict within which the conflict of Troy Maxon in Fences is taking place. So let's look through some of those conflicts. Let's just observe. I've given you a high level view of the play's sort of plot and the conflicts. It doesn't have a very strong plot. I don't mean that as an insult. It's not a plot heavy play. It's really a character study. And so the plot is what I was just talking about, the conflicts among and within the characters. So I want to look at select moments in the play that bring some of those conflicts into relief, or point out other elements of the play that I haven't mentioned. So just going on that last point about the American dream, so-called, this is a persistent thought that's had throughout the play. I mentioned one moment when Troy says, I got what I wanted. I sort of broke the color barrier at my job and was able to get into the literal driver's seat in the garbage truck. But now I'm kind of lonely. I'm isolated. I'm alone. I don't have, camaraderie. I don't have my people with me. And we see a similar conversation early in the play, where Rose says to him, there's a lot of people don't know they can do no better than they're doing now. That's just something you got to learn. A lot of folks still shop at Bella's. And Troy says, ain't nothing wrong with shopping at Bella's. She got fresh food. And so the conflict is between Rose is saying, if you can make more money if you put your mind to it, you can have kind of a more materially comfortable life, even allowing for race and class. And so she says, for instance, people still shop at this presumably black-owned corner store where you could shop at the A&P, which is this chain which has cheaper prices. She says, Bella charges 10 cents more. And Troy says, the A&P ain't never done nothing for me. I spend my money where I'm treated right. I go down to Bella, say, I need a loaf of bread. I'll pay you on Friday. She give it to me. What sense that make when I got money to go and spend it somewhere else and ignore the person who done right by me? That ain't in the Bible. And then he ends up by saying, I'll do my shopping where the people been good to me. So in other words, is this... So there's kind of a paradox here. It's an injustice that African Americans are excluded from so many areas of American life, particularly in terms of their economic aspirations. That's an injustice. Wilson is clear about that. But there's also a kind of danger that if you get access to that, you get assimilated into this culture that isn't yours, and you have to leave your culture, which was, as we've already said, very creatively forged in struggle and oppression behind. And is that something we, Wilson says, want to do? Is that a good thing? Do we want to assimilate? Is there a way to have both of these things at once? In the same way that Wilson says the ground he stands on is the double ground of the European dramatic tradition and the Black radical tradition. Is there some way to stand on that double ground, or is that impossible? And I don't think this play ever fully answers that question. I think it's an open question that the play leaves for us about, as I put it in the slide, aspiration or assimilation. What is the way to negotiate that conflict? And I don't think there's going to be one way. I don't think there's going to be one answer to a question like that. It's a very complicated question that is asked in this play in the Black community, and we've seen asked of other communities. We've seen it asked of the Jewish American and the Native American and the Asian American and the Latin American community throughout this course. And so I think it's something that that many communities in America, they struggled with how to answer this question. And we're going to see it further in further texts we read throughout the semester. So that's one thing I want to point out. The second thing I want to point out is what I use the term magical realism, and now I'm using this term mythic realism. I'm just trying to keep things interesting on the slides here by varying up my terminology. But there is this substratum of the play that is not strictly realistic, where Troy says, I talked to death. I dealt with the devil. He says, and then we have Gabriel, who says, I was in heaven. I talked to St. Peter. I'm going to blow the trumpet for St. Peter to open his gates. There's this supernatural undercurrent that these characters exist on a plane of myth, of the supernatural that's just barely undergirding this seeming working class realism that the play otherwise exhibits. And that's a particular quality of Wilson's drama, as it is of Toni Morrison's fiction and of Louise Erdrich's fiction, as we'll see next week. So this mythical, this magical realism. And I think partially it has to do with this idea of multiculturalism, that Bono says to Troy, you got some Uncle Remus in your blood, this idea of the African-American folkloric tradition, which ultimately goes back to particularly West African religious and ritual practices, and is connected to religious and ritual practices of hoodoo and voodoo in the South and the Caribbean, as we've already seen Ishmael Reed talking about, which also goes back through the African diaspora to Africa. So on the one level, this play is realistic, but on the other hand, it has this mythical undercurrent, which is synthesized with Christianity. So Reed would want to say, don't get involved with Christianity. That's the oppressor to this tradition. But Wilson, and this is also true of Toni Morrison, is a syncretist religiously. That is, they want to put things together. So you see the Christian tradition and Christian ideas and iconography sort of spliced together with this ultimately African diasporic sense of spirituality. And like I said, that's a lot clearer in other plays by Wilson, like Joe Turner's Come and Gone or Gem of the Ocean, but it's still present. It's this backbeat, this subtext in Fences that I think lends his drama its sort of mythic quality, in some of the same way that Blanche's romantic idealism lends a similar mythic quality to Streetcar Named Desire. A quality, I don't want to pursue this point, but this quality of the mythic substructure is largely absent from Death of a Salesman, which is why I don't think it's as good as Fences or A Streetcar Named Desire. But anyway, that's just some subtext to my lesson of why I made the syllabus that way. But anyway, this mythic, this magical realism that gives this play a spiritual dimension, and also this kind of global dimension. It puts it in the history of global religion. And it just makes, and it adds to Troy's grandeur of character when he says, well, let's just read this. Death standing there, staring at me, carrying that sickle in his hand. Finally, he say, you want bound over for another year? See, just like that? You want bound over for another year? I told him, bound over, hell, let's settle this now. It seemed like he kind of fell back when I said that, and all the cold went out of me. I reached down and grabbed that sickle and threw it just as far as I could throw it, and me and him commenced a wrestling. We wrestled for 3 days and 3 nights. I can't say where I found the strength from. So he's wrestling with death, which I think alludes to the biblical story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. And how long does he wrestle? 3 days and 3 nights. Who was dealing with death for 3 days and 3 nights? Jesus. So Troy's kind of a Christ figure here. So we have this great mythical, magical undercurrent that makes this, it's realism, but it's mythic realism, it's magical realism, it's super realism, it's spiritual realism, it's realism plus. And I think that gives it this added grandeur and creates this character as a great man, not a morally great man, a morally deeply problematic man, but this largeness of the spirit is given Troy by surrounding him with these spiritual contexts and appurtenances. So that's the mythic or magical realism of the play. There's the theme of fathers and sons. I think possibly the most, well, there's 2 very famous scenes of confrontation in this play. One is the scene where Corey says to Troy, why don't you like me? Which is a very sort of devastating thing, you know, for the son to say to his father, why don't you like me? And Troy says something very interesting in response. He says, like you? I go out of here every morning, bust my butt, putting up with them crackers, kind of a pejorative name for white people, every day, 'cause I like you? You about the biggest fool I ever saw. It's my job. It's my responsibility. You understand that? A man got to take care of his family. You live in my house, sleep you behind on my bedclothes, fill you belly up with my food, 'cause you my son, you my flesh and blood. Not 'cause I like you, 'cause it's my duty to take care of you. I owe a responsibility to you. Let's get this straight right here before it go along any further. I ain't got to like you. Mr. Rand don't give me money come payday 'cause he likes me. He gives me 'cause he owe me. I done everything I had to give you. I done give you everything I had to give you. So he doesn't even say, I don't like you, I love you. He says, we are in this contract with each other. That is the contract of family, the contract even of race. You're my flesh and blood, and I owe to you everything that you are, and I've given to you everything that you are, and nothing of the emotions have to come into that, really. And that's a hard doctrine. It's you might say, a cold doctrine, and maybe we can see some of the ways in which the way that Troy's character was formed in hardship has kind of marred his emotional life, that he's unable to give certain things emotionally to his family because he owes them as he sees it. And he gives that as the explanation for his adultery to Rose. And yet there is also, similarly here, there is a kind of grandeur in this worldview as well, that you can't just be an individualist, that you can't just be out for yourself, that you can't just be concerned with what you feel, that you have to pay your contract, that you have to pay the terms of your contract, and that's the contract that Troy keeps with his son. And so it's ambiguous, it's ambivalent, and maybe this is one of those things where each reader and viewer comes to their own decision about how they feel about this, because there's something to it, and yet there's some flaws in it as well. And so I do think it's clear that Troy is right when he talks about what he gave Corey. But does he have the right to take the things from Corey that he took? Corey judges for himself that he doesn't. He says later in the play, "You ain't never done nothing but hold me back. Afraid I was going to be better than you. All you ever did was try and make me scared of you." So that he's been this oppressive presence in his son's life, and out of the rather low motivation of envy and resentment, that his son will grow up in a world where he has more opportunities than his father, and so he'll be able to have more success than his father, and so his father resents that, and so withholds the opportunities from him. And I think we can probably agree that that's a flaw in Troy's character, and yet we see where he was coming from when he dramatizes this confrontation with his father. He explains this at one point in the play to Bono and Lyons, this conflict he had with his own father, and he says his father was the devil. So in some sense, his father was the first time he wrestled with the devil, when he confronted him over his father's desire really to rape this girl who is Troy's girlfriend as a young teenager. And so and you'll note that the conflicts between men in this play are physical, that he has, I think, 3 physical confrontations with Corey. He has a physical confrontation with his own father. He has physical confrontations with death and the devil, or at least with death. And so this idea of physical, of this almost this warrior mentality that also goes back to Greek tragedy. And so he says he was the devil himself, but he also says, I could feel him kicking in my blood. So that's the sense in which his fights with death and the devil are, I think, also mythical corollaries for his internal psychological struggle. When he's fighting death and the devil, he's really fighting something in himself, that part of him he gets from his father, that violent part, that oppressive part. And so this struggle between fathers and sons takes place between them, even physically. It becomes a physical confrontation between them when they're literally beating each other. But it also takes place inside them as they fight this image of the man they want or don't want to be. So that's the father and son struggle. There's also the husband and wife struggle in this play. And I think that's partially where the title comes in. Bono tells Troy, because the title comes in where he's building this fence that Rose has requested him to build. And he's also trying to build a fence between himself and death. He also is building kind of metaphorical fences between himself and other people to whom he can't give love, such as his wife and his son. And this question of what is a fence. And I think I should have looked this up, but I think the way the play is usually staged is that where the fence would be, well, I think you can do it this way. I don't think it necessarily is always done this way, but the fence would be the fourth wall. So we're looking kind of through and over the fence into the theater. So there's the fence between the audience and the drama. But Bono says some people build fences to keep people out. And that's what Troy seems to be doing. He builds a fence. He says, I'm going to keep death on the other side of it. But he's also keeping change on the other side of it, the change that has come to his society, the changes that have altered his world and given his children opportunities that he couldn't have. So he's building fences to keep people out. But Bono says other people build fences to keep people in. Rose wants to hold on to you all. She loves you. So that's the fence. And again, we come back to that division in Wilson's own character that I pointed out at the beginning of the lecture between, wanting to be separatist, wanting to be with his community and honor the uniqueness and individuality of that community given its history and the history it had to overcome to make that culture. On the one hand, that's the fence to keep the people you love in. But you also don't just want to keep people out in some automatic way. So there has to be some communication with the people on the other side of the fence, hence Wilson saying, I write plays in the Western tradition. So there has to be, again, it's a difficulty, it's a productive tension between wanting to be your own thing and the legitimacy of that desire, but also both for individuals and for communities, there's a need also to reach out and to commune with other people and to give and receive love and affection and influence and intellectual communion with other people. So that's the question. Why are you building the fence? The fence is inevitable, metaphorically, the fence is inevitable. There will always be some divisions between people for reasons that are both good and bad. But what's the way you handle that fence? Why are you building that fence? And what's it for? And how can you both stay behind it, but also move across and through it and build it in a useful way? And so one destructive fence is the fence that he puts up between himself and his wife, again, metaphorically. So he, as I said, gives this explanation of why he has betrayed his wife sexually, why he has cheated on her. And Wilson plays fair. I think he's a very interesting writer because unlike a lot of the male writers of his generation, and we might look at Philip Roth here, and Arthur Miller here, both, and maybe Ishmael Reed to a certain extent. Unlike a lot of the male writers of his generation, he sees things and writes things from his female characters' points of view in ways that show that he understands that women have their own particular challenges and struggles to face in society. So he doesn't just, represent female characters as just kind of holding back his male characters in the way that a writer like Roth sometimes does. But he also doesn't just dismiss men's struggles in the way that a writer like Ursula K. Le Guin, and she unnames them, seems to do, where Adam in Adam and Eve is just this idiot that can just sort of be written off. He also portrays the way that men, while they have a kind of power imbalance in a sexist society with women, nevertheless, particularly black men, working class men, have their own struggle and their own inner life. And so he, I think, writes, as does Toni Morrison and as does Louise Erdrich, and as do a lot of writers we're going to read in this class, both male and female, write from a very balanced, gendered point of view, whereas some other writers we read and have read don't. But he gives Troy, he allows Troy his explanation. And while we don't morally approve, it's something I think we can psychologically understand, that he had this need to to just escape this life he experienced as nothing, as is increasingly oppressively a series of responsibilities. But he gives voice to Rose, and Rose gets this big speech. She also gets the last word, by the way, which we'll look at too in the play. She gets this big speech where she says, I get what you're saying, but you're not taking into account the fact that I basically feel the same way you do. And he's not very nice to her throughout the play. He says, he says things like, get in there and make me dinner, get back in the kitchen. And he's very sort of sexually crude with her at times. And she seems to put up with it for the first part of the play, but then she increasingly finds her voice. He says, I've been standing in the same place for 18 years. And she says, I've been standing with you. I've been right here with you, Troy. I got a life too. I gave 18 years of my life to stand in the same spot with you. Don't you think I ever wanted other things? Don't you think I had dreams and hopes? What about my life? What about me? Don't you think it ever crossed my mind to want to know other men? That I wanted to lay up somewhere and forget about my responsibilities? That I wanted someone to make me laugh so I could feel good? You're not the only one who's got wants and needs, but I held on to you, Troy. I took all my feelings, my wants and needs, my dreams, and I buried them inside you. I planted a seed and watched and prayed over it. I planted myself inside you and waited to bloom. And it didn't take me 18 years to find out that the soil was hard and rocky and it wasn't never gonna bloom. But and she says, I stayed with you. And you'll note, the thing she's saying to him is the same thing he said to Corey. That, I didn't necessarily like you all that much after a certain point in our marriage, but I owed you this, and you owe me this. And how dare you break this contract, you break this oath, you break this responsibility. So she gets her voice, and she becomes increasingly powerful throughout the play, particularly the moment where Alberta, who had been his lover, dies in childbirth, and he brings Raynell, his daughter, home and says to Rose, I can't care for this baby, and are we really going to put this baby out? And she says, no. She says, I understand I can't leave this baby without a mother, but from now on, you're a womanless man. I'm not going to leave this child motherless, but I'm going to leave you womanless. And so she goes her own way and raises this child as her own, and she doesn't throw him out. They still live together. She still keeps her family, but she keeps it on her own terms. She becomes the increasingly dominant figure in the play until at the end she gets the last word over Troy, literally, because he dies, and she sort of pronounces his elegy, his eulogy, his requiem. And that's a clear callback to Death of a Salesman, where Willy Loman, the hero of that play, dies, and the last act is called the Requiem, and his wife, who he had treated in a similar way as Troy treats Rose, gets the sort of a last word over his coffin. And we see that at the end. And so the last act, or the last scene, is after his death. You note he dies in 1965, so around the time of the Civil Rights Act, as if to say that one phase of African-American history ends with Troy Maxson and another begins. So he kind of represents the community as it was in this period of the Great Migration, so there was the period of slavery, then there was the period of Jim Crow and sharecropping in the South, then the period of the Great Migration, and then the Civil Rights Black Power period. And he is this generation of the Great Migration, and he dies. And he gets a great death scene because he has this sort of rags that he's assembled as a baseball that he kind of hits with a bat from time to time. And Rose says, I watched him, and he hit the ball, and he kind of stared at it, and then he smiled, and he fell over. And so it's almost this triumph. He's sort of fighting death the last time, and he keeps his own, but he ends up losing, and he dies. And so the last scene takes place as they're heading to his funeral, and Corey says, I'm not going to go to his funeral. And Rose says, yes, you are. You're definitely going to go to his funeral. You're not going to do that. And basically what's concluded, and Corey comes to this when he sings the blues song about the dog, Blue that Troy had always sung with Raynell, and they sort of share, he and his young half-sister kind of share this recollection. They both, they're carrying on the heritage of Troy by singing this song that is the kind of eulogy for this dog. And so he realizes that he has to go to his father's funeral, that he can't keep sort of fighting him in this way. And Rose says to him, you can't escape your father. You can't be anybody but your father's son. But that doesn't mean you're doomed to all his flaws. You have to wrestle with his shadow and make that heritage your own. And I think that's so much a part of what Wilson is saying about culture in this play and in that speech, The Ground on Which I Stand, that culture can't be inert. You can't just pass on a heritage unchanged. Every generation struggles with it anew and incorporates other influences, but you do have to pass it on. So it's a complex and a nuanced thought. The tradition has to be this vitally renewed thing. And that's what Corey learns. And Rose gives this final requiem, this elegy, this funeral speech in a way for Troy. She says, your daddy wanted you to be everything he wasn't, and at the same time he tried to make you into everything he was. I don't know if he was right or wrong, but I do know he meant to do more good than he meant to do harm. And that's interesting because it's about his intention. It kind of reminds me of another play that's in the background here is Shakespeare's King Lear. And King Lear is this tragic father figure who's the progenitor of Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman and Troy and Fences. And he says, I am more sinned against than sinning, that I did bad things, but more bad things were done to me. And it's interesting because what Rose says, I think Wilson clearly has that in mind. Rose gives a kind of play on that, but she makes it about what he wanted to do. I know he meant to do more good than he meant to do harm. He wasn't always right. Sometimes when he touched, he bruised. And sometimes when he took me in his arms, he cut. But on balance, he meant to do good. And so that's his tragic grandeur. And she says, I took what life offered me in the way of being a woman. And so this is Wilson acknowledging that just as life didn't offer the same things to black people as to white people in this time period, so it didn't offer the same things to women as to men. And so Rose has gotten an unequal deal in some of the same ways that Troy got an unequal deal, but she took what was offered and she made of it what she could, and she, like Troy, tried to make a good life. And this is the point we're left with. And then finally, the last action of the play is this idea of drama as ritual, because I think Wilson was very conscious both of the fact that his works reflected, as we've already discussed, a spiritual tradition of the African diaspora that required rituals to renew it, but also that the Western tradition of drama that he acknowledges he takes his place in also begins life as religious ritual. So this is a way in which there's commonality between these European and African traditions. And we see that when the play ends with, and you'll note what happens, is that it ends with Gabriel gonna blow the trumpet to tell St. Peter to open the gates, so the Christian image. But for some reason, no sound comes out of the trumpet. And so instead of blowing the trumpet, he does this atavistic, which means going back to the distant past, almost to the prehistoric past ritual of dance. And we might see this dance as the dance that Ishmael Reed was talking about, as the dance that is black music, that is the hoodoo tradition that goes back to Africa. Or we could see it as the dancing in which Greek tragedy began in archaic Greece. It's not clear if this is a European or an African dance or both, but it is something that takes the place of the Christian image of blowing the trumpet. So ultimately, Wilson seems to side with Ishmael Reed and getting away from Christian imagery and Christian iconography to both European and African archaic cultures that are renewed in the present in the modern drama. He begins to dance a slow, strange dance, eerie and life-giving, a dance of atavistic signature and ritual. Lyons attempts to embrace him. Gabriel pushes Lyons away. He begins to howl in what is an attempt at song, or perhaps a song turning back into itself in an attempt at speech. He finishes his dance, and the gates of heaven stand open as wide as God's closet. That's the way that go. And so he dances to open the afterlife to Troy and sort of shouts Troy into his afterlife. And so drama, tragic drama, becomes what it always was, which was ritual, and black culture becomes what I think Wilson always thought it was, which was ritual. And so we have this ritual that sees off this era of African American history in the form of this flawed but great man, Troy Maxson, and that is Fences. And that is that concludes our study of drama this semester. From now on, we will stay with fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. But I hope that this play and Williams's play, both of which look back on a very long time scale to the very long history of drama in ways that some of the other literature we've been reading didn't, and was more immersed in the present. I hope that this gives you a sense of the power of drama. So that's August Wilson, that's Fences. Thanks very much and have a great day.